While the mainstream media tracks the flight paths of B-2 bombers over Beirut, they are missing the real casualty of this conflict. The explosion you're hearing isn't just kinetic. It is the structural collapse of a 50-year-old financial monopoly. As you've likely noticed through the erratic heartbeat of the commodities market, we are no longer just witnessing a war in the Middle East. We are performing a deep dive analysis into the structural integrity of the petrodollar. For decades, Washington relied on a silent, unbreakable mechanism. The world bought oil in dollars, and those dollars were recycled back into US treasuries. Today, that mechanism is suffering from strategic inertia. The architects of US policy have become prisoners of structural pressures, failing to realize that by weaponizing the dollar, they created the very incentive for the world to destroy it. This erosion of trust starts at the very plumbing of global trade. As the conflict in Iran escalates, we are seeing the emergence of the unit, a development that marks a profound institutional obsolescence for the SWIFT system. The BRICS Plus bloc has moved beyond rhetoric into a lethal technical execution, a blockchain-based financial architecture backed 40% by physical gold and 60% by a basket of sovereign currencies. Unlike SWIFT, which functions as a centralized ledger under Washington's thumb, the unit is decentralized. By over-leveraging sanctions as a primary tool of statecraft, the US has triggered an unintended mutation, a parallel reality, where the greenback is no longer the gatekeeper of trade, and the Federal Reserve's delete button no longer works. Yet, the plumbing is only half the story. The true bedrock of the dollar's dominance has always been the desert sands of the Middle East, a foundation now being destabilized by what I call the neutralization of Riyadh. Since 1974, the US-Saudi Security Pact was the bedrock of global dollar demand. But as the geography of power shifts, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has opted for strategic autonomy over American alignment. By officially integrating the petro-yuan into its trade with China, Saudi Arabia is exposing the fiscal fragility of the American empire. This isn't just a trade deal, it's a structural defection. The kingdom has realized that in a multipolar world, a currency hedge is more valuable than a declining American nuclear umbrella. But as the traditional channels close, new, darker conduits are opening, specifically the Tehran-Shanghai Backdoor. To bypass naval blockades and financial freezes, Iran has institutionalized a gold for oil exchange through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Reuters confirms that transaction volumes have surged by 300% since the March 2026 escalation began, creating the ultimate dark pool for sovereign trade. When oil is traded for physical gold bullion, the US maritime and financial surveillance apparatus becomes effectively blind. These invisible gears are turning. While American carriers patrol the surface of the Gulf, the actual wealth is flowing through subterranean channels of gold and renminbi. The petrodollar isn't just being challenged, it is being bypassed. To truly understand the scale of this collapse, we must stop looking at the headlines and start looking at the ledger. We need to analyze the raw data that Washington is too terrified to acknowledge. The ledger of an empire is written in the cold, hard math of its interest rates. And right now, that math is reaching a terminal breaking point. To understand the structural collapse of the petrodollar, we must look past the headlines and into the yield paradox. For 50 years, the US Treasury benefited from a global system of forced recycling. Because the world traded oil exclusively in dollars, oil exporting nations were compelled to reinvest their massive surpluses back into US treasuries. This kept American borrowing costs artificially low, effectively allowing Washington to fund its global ambitions on the world's tab. But as the gold for oil backdoors in Shanghai and Tehran scale, that recycling pump has finally seized up. As of March 2026, the 10-year Treasury yield has surged past the psychological and systemic red line of 5.5%. This isn't just a number, it is a sign of institutional obsolescence. Because the global demand for dollars is evaporating, as BRICS Plus nations settle energy trades in gold, gold and local currencies, the Treasury is forced to offer higher and higher yields just to find a buyer for its debt. This has triggered a catastrophic feedback loop. The higher the yield, the more it costs the United States to service its staggering $36 trillion national debt. We have officially entered the terminal stage of debt monetization. When the private market and foreign sovereigns stop buying our debt, the Federal Reserve is forced to become the lender of last resort. They are literally printing new dollars out of thin air just to pay the interest on the money they already printed. This is the ultimate incentive failure. The Fed is trapped between raising rates to fight the inflation caused by $130 oil and lowering rates to keep the government from going bankrupt. For the first time in history, American interest payments have eclipsed the entire national defense budget. The invisible gears of the American economy are no longer generating wealth. They are merely grinding through the friction of interest, leading to a state of permanent fiscal fragility. Geography remains the ultimate constraint, and for the last century, the United States mastered the Rimland theory, controlling the edges of Eurasia to contain its rivals. But as you've likely observed, that containment is suffering from a massive institutional rupture. What we're seeing in 2026 is not just a regional skirmish. It is a coordinated geographic effort to render the US Navy and the US Treasury irrelevant in the heart of the world island. This strategic erosion is perhaps most visible in the neutralizing of what was once China's greatest vulnerability, the Malacca trap. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that the US Navy could choke off Beijing's energy supply at a moment's notice. However, the administration's primary incentive failure was the belief that military dominance could indefinitely suspend economic gravity. By pushing Iran into a corner, the United States inadvertently completed the final overland link of the Belt and Road Initiative. Today, Iranian oil doesn't need the Strait of Malacca. It flows through a network of hardened pipelines and overland rail routes connecting Tehran directly to Western China. This is the unintended mutation of the US blockade. In an attempt to starve Iran, Washington created a sanction-proof fortress in the heart of Asia. The geography of energy has shifted from the blue water, where the United States is king, to the heartland, where US carriers are merely expensive targets. Yet this structural paradox isn't confined to Asia. It is unfolding inside the hallowed halls of Brussels. While the European Union maintains its public alignment with Washington, the private reality is one of extreme fiscal fragility. With Qatar's LNG facilities offline and the Strait of Hormuz contested, Europe is facing an industrial death spiral that no amount of rhetoric can solve. The EU's traditional reliance on the American security umbrella has come into direct conflict with its basic need for physical survival. And so, we are witnessing a Darwinian response. The emergence of shadow clearinghouses, financial institutions designed to trade with BRICS Plus members entirely under the radar. Europe has realized that remaining a partner to a declining hegemon is a recipe for total deindustrialization. This revolt against the old order reaches its peak when we examine the rapid expansion of the BRICS Plus bloc. By incorporating Egypt, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia, the bloc now effectively controls every major maritime choke point in the Eastern Hemisphere, from the Suez Canal to the Bab el-Mandeb to the Persian Gulf. This is strategic inertia at its worst. Washington is still playing a 20th century game of global policeman, while its opponents have already bought the police station. The world is not fighting the United States for democracy. They are fighting for insulation. They are building a system where an American president's signature on a sanctions bill carries as much weight as a pebble thrown into the ocean. The invisible gears of the old world are being replaced by a new, decentralized machinery of power, one that no longer requires a dollar-based permission slip. Military power is not merely a function of steel, gunpowder, and willpower. It is fundamentally a byproduct of the currency that funds it. The American superpower is currently confronting a state of superpower insolvency. For half a century, the petrodollar was the high-octane fuel that allowed the US Navy to project power into every corner of the globe. Without the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency, the 800 overseas bases and the 12 carrier strike groups that once defined global order are no longer strategic assets. They have become unfunded liabilities. Washington's primary incentive failure was the belief that military kinetic force could indefinitely protect a currency that the rest of the world no longer had a reason to hold. A single carrier strike group costs billions of dollars annually in fuel, maintenance, and personnel. When the dollar loses its reserve status, the U.S. Treasury can no longer print the logistics required to keep these ships at sea. We are approaching the expensive scrap metal scenario, a moment where these billion-dollar vessels are tethered to domestic ports, not because of a peace treaty, but because the Treasury literally cannot afford the fuel to project them abroad. This creates a forced strategic retreat of unprecedented proportions. As the dollar devalues, the United States is being compelled to withdraw its footprint from the Middle East, the South China Sea, and Eastern Europe, not by diplomatic choice, but by mathematical bankruptcy. This geopolitical power vacuum is being filled instantly by the rising influence of BRICS Plus and regional hegemons. Domestically, the fallout is even more volatile. As military funding is cannibalized to pay for the skyrocketing debt interest described in Chapter 2, the invisible gears of social stability begin to fail. From the decay of critical infrastructure to the inability to fund local law enforcement, the collapse of the empire abroad is triggering a chaotic, unintended mutation of the American social contract at home. The era of the global policeman has reached its fiscal expiration date, leaving the American public to face the reality of an empire they can no longer afford to staff. We aren't just watching a regional conflict. We are performing a live autopsy on the Great Reset of sovereignty. For 50 years, the petrodollar acted as the invisible gravity of global markets, allowing the United States to export inflation while funding a global military. But that gravity is failing. Washington attempted to freeze the world in the amber of 1974, but its institutional inertia blinded it to a simple truth. You cannot enforce a financial monopoly on a world that has already found the exit. This is an incentive failure of American grand strategy. By over-weaponizing the dollar, Washington transformed the greenback from a global utility into a geopolitical liability. The shift from paper trust to physical sovereignty is the most profound realignment since Bretton Woods. Power is no longer measured by digital printing, but by the control of tangible assets, gold, energy, and the infrastructure to bypass the gatekeeper. The invisible gears of the old world are being replaced by a decentralized, multipolar machinery. The BRICS Plus bloc isn't just seeking to replace the dollar, they are seeking to insulate themselves from it entirely. As an American, the question is no longer whether your currency remains the global reserve. It is how your 401k survives a world where the United States is no longer the exorbitant exception. When the world stops speaking the language of the dollar, what asset will you use to protect your family's future? The world is rapidly approaching a critical moment of convergence, where kinetic warfare and financial contagion collide. Based on real-time shifts at the Shanghai Gold Exchange and naval maneuvers in the Persian Gulf, we are no longer looking at a distant threat. We are looking at a near-future reality, defined by two distinct scenarios. Scenario A, the nuclear for dollar last stand. 20% probability. In this trajectory, Washington executes a high-stakes diplomatic pivot. To prevent a total Saudi defection, the United States offers Riyadh a comprehensive nuclear energy and defense treaty in exchange for an ironclad commitment to price oil exclusively in dollars. While this could trigger a temporary relief rally in the greenback, it is merely a strategic band-aid. It buys time, but it exacerbates long-term fiscal fragility by adding massive military liabilities to a budget already drowning in interest payments. It is a desperate attempt to preserve a 20th century monopoly using 21st century debt. Scenario B, the gold-oil convergence, 80% probability. The far more likely path is the official institutionalization of gold-backed oil futures in Shanghai and Tehran. If Iran successfully bypasses the naval blockade via physical gold settlement, it triggers a currency contagion across the global south. Nations like Brazil, Indonesia, and India, already wary of US sanctions, will accelerate their de-dollarization efforts to secure their energy sovereignty. This effectively creates a parallel financial universe. In this near-future window, the dollar index, the DXY, could plunge below the 90 mark, causing domestic gas prices to surge toward $8 per gallon. For For the American public, this marks the end of cheap energy and the beginning of a systemic liquidity crunch. The invisible gears of the petrodollar will seize, forcing the Federal Reserve into an impossible choice: hyperinflation or total economic freeze. The era of American financial exceptionalism isn't just fading, it is reaching its fiscal expiration date. The board is set, the gears are turning. The question is not whether the system changes, but whether you are prepared for what comes next. If the dollar is no longer the world's anchor, what is yours? Subscribe to stay ahead of the collapse.